Well, thanks everybody for making time tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm really honored to speak to such an exciting and ambitious group as ProSocial World. A little bit about me. My name's Abby Rapoport, um, and I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat here. And I started life as a political reporter, and did that work for quite some time, mostly based in Texas. I did state-based reporting, traveling around a rather large state, and getting to know people there and sort of writing about political movements. Um, from there, I ended up starting what I'll talk about tonight, Stranger's Guide, which is a publication, place-based publication that's much more in the humanities side of things, long-form essays, fiction, alongside other kinds of storytelling. And so as a result of that, I wear a couple of hats, and I'm excited to talk about some of those tonight. Local news in the sort of old school, just the facts, ma'am style, alongside some slightly edgier and more creative type nonfiction. So with that, I'll start. Let's see if it's gonna let me. Okay, cool. So tonight I'm sort of talking about how sort of place-based storytelling can create social change, cultural change. And so sort of starting with a very obvious point, that shared narratives have long been a key part of group identity, right? So, not news to anyone here, I'm sure, but, knowing that we share the same traditions, knowing that we share the same religious texts, these have long been ways that we felt a relationship with people who we don't necessarily know personally. And it's been a way that we've kind of built trust within our communities, a sense that we do the same things, we believe the same things, we have the same stories that we tell. In the modern times, that's all been rooted in media, right? Print media to start, and then later radio, television, many other forms of media. And as Chip and others will know, I'm a big sort of, I was very impacted early in my life by the work of Benedict Anderson on imagined communities. And I think that kind of comes to bear here, that through print media and other forms of media, we're able to build a sense of relationship with people we may not know based on the fact that we share sets of facts from which we're making decisions. That media was built, this is where I kind of get a little bit more into an argument. That media was built around what I kind of call world building, right? Stories that are reflecting our community and also explaining communities to one another. So I can read my local news, I can watch my local station, and I'm reflected the community of which I'm a part. And I can also go watch someone else's news, read someone else's newspaper, and get a sense of that community as distinct from mine, right? I want to note, because there's a tendency to make a kind of a glory days, a golden age argument. That era, which has sort of ended in sort of the early part of the 21st century, there were a lot of challenges with it. It was hardly perfect. A lot of the power structures that it sort of perpetuated, it made it very difficult for a lot of voices from a lot of communities to get the limelight. There was a lot that needed change. However, it did lend to civic cohesion. And I think that's kind of, for purposes today, that's sort of the point, that when we had a shared media, we had more civic cohesion. So since 2005, again, hopefully not telling you anything you don't know, we've seen a rapid decline in storytelling media, and that's mostly been replaced by social media. I do want to take a minute to say that I think if you're not in this world, the extent to which the crisis in journalism has happened, is happening, is easy to miss. 2.5 papers close per week in the United States right now. Huge quantities of communities have no local news of any kind available. And since 2005, the US has lost almost 2/3 of its newspaper journalists. It's a total of 2,900 newspapers that have shut down. So it's the news, while we get used to hearing this information over and over again, it's pretty startling how much less access to reliable information we have as a country now than we did 19 years ago. It's orders of magnitude. And That's particularly true in a variety of parts of the country that aren't on the coasts, tend to be more rural, tend to be poorer, tend to be less white. There's even less access to information. But it's also a global trend. So across the country, with rises in ethno-nationalism, with rise in authoritarianism, there's been a decline, maybe not as precipitous as in the US, but nonetheless there in Canada, in Australia, in a variety of countries that maintain a political system that allows for a free press. There, you've seen that decline based on the market forces. And then in addition to that, we've seen a rise in authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism that has put further pressure on journalism around the world. And so in a lot of countries that used to have more robust journalism ecosystems, those have dwindled based on the threats to journalists as well as market forces. So that's not good. I would start by saying. It's been replaced by social media, but social media is far less effective. We know a lot. We know that anyone who's spent some time on Facebook, anyone who's spent some time on the social media formerly known as Twitter, knows these are pretty toxic places these days. A lot of that has to do with choices that, oh, excuse me. Let's see if I can go back. There we go. A lot of that has had to do with choices that our owners have made, right? So when you had local papers, when you had the main media being within community, owners tended to also be part of that community. And while I would never say they were doing anything out of the goodness of their hearts, the incentive structure for what they were doing incentivized reliable information and civic trust, generally speaking. Under social media, it's a very different incentive structure. To get people on Twitter all the time requires people to be upset, to be sort of in a sort of somewhat addicted state. There's been a lot of work by the Shorenstein Center and elsewhere on sort of the effects that social media have on sort of the way that we engage with discourse, political discourse in particular. But in addition to that, even if we had stronger social media ownership that sort of was more focused on public goods, it's hyper personal, right? When we talk in social media, we talk about the I, even on the somewhat healthier systems, these tend to be personal stories that are about me. And maybe you want to kind of join in on my story, but they're not collective stories, right? And then additionally, they're not necessarily trustworthy, right? It's very difficult to know what is true and what's not when we get in social media. Again, there are a lot of impacts to this: loneliness, lack of connection, hyperpolarization, the sort of general flattening of our sort of political discourse. It's decreased access to reliable civic information. A fun fact that I love to share for people who may not know is that municipalities that do not have newspapers tend to pay $650,000 more per issue and per bond that comes up. So there are like real costs as well as civic implications to this work. But
Could you just repeat that, Abby? That factoid.
Absolutely. That when in municipalities where there is no newspaper, on bond issues that come up on their ballot, they tend to pay an average of $650,000 more than those who do have a newspaper, an active newspaper in their community. So there's additionally studies showing that candidates who are more extreme get elected in news deserts. You see corruption increase. I mean, there's a long list of costs, right, to an individual community when you lose a reliable source of what's called civic information, right? But also what I want to sort of note for the purposes of this talk is that it's lessened our ability to understand place, right? We don't have a sense of our communities, place-based communities, and we don't have a relationship of our place-based community in relation to other place-based communities, right? That's something that's really declined as a result of the law, the sort of general crisis in journalism that we've been seeing over the last 2 decades. So, enter the importance of place-based storytelling, right? Now, I want to spend a minute here on I'm going to spend the second half of the talk really talking about the work we do at Strangers Guide and sort of a humanities-based approach to place-based storytelling. But I want to take a minute to say that I also wear a hat. I do a lot of work on local news initiatives, generally consulting with more traditional, like I said, sort of, you can think of it as like just the facts ma'am type information. And that can be delivered in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be in a newspaper. It doesn't even have to be by sort of a text-based story. There's been a ton of experimentation in how to get residents of a community more information about their geographic community, right? And so that broadly is defined as civic information. And I think that's a really important piece, something that I spend a different part of my life working on, and I think is critical to the ability to do other kinds of place-based storytelling that's based more in the arts and more in kind of creative spaces, right? Because it's so important to building trust. I also would sort of note here that work, that sort of civic information effort has become a bit of a cause recently in philanthropic circles. It's unclear if it'll remain a cause. I think there's a sense that we've got a few years where major funders, particularly in the US, are sold that local news is a key piece to functional democracy, but we're not sure how long that'll last. But I think that it's really important as we sort of see that emphasis on this sort of just the facts style journalism, that we also bring in a more humanities-based approach, because civic information fails to include a number of stories that need to be told. I think it is always going to be limited in terms of building trust and a sense of belonging. And that's really where I've been most interested, is how do we tell stories that both create pride in our community, that make us feel a sense of belonging, and also question our community and question how we can be better, what's fair and what's unjust, who are we hearing from, and who do we need to work better to include. And that kind of work, I think, is best done in humanities-based spaces. So because of that interest, I have been the co-founder and running a publication called Strangers Guide. We launched in 2018. And our goals, there were a few of them. So for one thing, we really wanted to bring an idea of a nuanced view of a place. And by that, I mean, we wanted to bring together stories that make us feel great and stories that make us that challenge us and force us to ask tough questions. That both of those things are invaluable to kind of understanding and approaching any place that we're talking about, whether it's our home, a place that we claim, or a place we're learning about, a place that we're trying to educate ourselves on, right? Second, we wanted to break down silos on a number of different fronts. And the best way, I think, when I talk about this is when we hear about certain countries, certain cities, they tend to be in different sections of the newspaper section, different magazines, right? When we're talking about Scandinavia, odds are we're reading about it in a design publication. We're reading about it in terms of its, cultural prowess. When we're reading about Colombia, we're usually reading a different kind of story. And we really wanted to bring those kinds of stories together so that we're reading about the arts and culture and style alongside the challenges that every place brings together, right? We also wanted to build a pipeline for international storytelling, and we really felt this was important in the communications between communities. So we felt it was critical that more writers, photographers, and other kinds of storytellers could get in front of US-based audiences. We're a US-based publication, so that's the community that we're rooted in. And we wanted to ensure that more people with alternative perspectives, both on their home and on our home, could provide those. That's something I'll just take a minute to say as we talk about that breakdown in journalism. One of the costs of that doesn't get talked about as much is there's been a total implosion in the sort of foreign correspondence model that used to be the main pipeline for writers and photographers outside the US to get in front of US editors and US audiences. And that has really broken down, whether you're talking about newspapers, whether you're talking about television and broadcast journalism, or you're even talking about books, which I think is in some ways the most troubling. But across all of those, it's significantly more difficult for writers outside the US to get in front of US audiences. And I will say, particularly when those writers and photographers are coming from marginalized communities within those different international locations, and when those writers and photographers want to tell stories that run counter to traditional narratives, right? If you want to write this story about Scandinavia's extreme challenges with immigration, you're going to have a hard time figuring out where to place that. That's not a story that many American editors have room for right now, right? They should. There's a lot of reasons why that's a problem, but that is where things stand right now. Additionally, and I think perhaps as significantly, we wanted to figure out a space for slow stories, for beautiful stories. And that was true across place as well. We felt like there were a lot of locations that tended to only show up in newsprint, whose stories rarely got the full color treatment, right? That I think we feel every community deserves and requires. And so we decided to launch a print publication. And here you can see some of the covers that we've done. Each of our guides is devoted to a single location, and it's almost entirely populated by writers and photographers from that location. That includes writers and photographers who are writing from the diaspora, but we don't go to press on any issue. We don't publish it online. We don't do anything unless we can guarantee that we're above 80% local writers and photographers, and we usually hit closer to 90-95%. We also bring together a wide range of topics, and this is what I was talking about earlier: sports and arts and culture, alongside refugee narratives, incarceration stories, other kinds of pieces on corruption, etc. And finally, we bring together different formats: creative nonfiction, investigative reporting, um, short stories, photo essays, interviews. We end every issue with what we call our first person narratives. And these are using interviews that are then edited into kind of short essays alongside portraits of individuals. And that ranges from, sort of just a slew of people on the street about what it means to be from this place for them, to people who share some community or identity that sort of bears telling. So here you can see sort of two different kinds of stories that we published. One is by Wole Soyinka, who was the first Black Nobel laureate. We sat down with him. When we first started this work, we really, in retrospect, we're taking a bit of a leap. And one of our goals was because we wanted to bring more pipelines for up and coming writers, voices who maybe hadn't gotten much attention in the past, we wanted to anchor each issue with one or two very famous writers and photographers. So Wole Soyinka, one of the most famous writers from Nigeria, agreed to anchor that issue with an original essay called Unsinkable City on his lifetime in Lagos. The Lagos issue ended up including a wide range of stories, including pieces on issues facing journalists and the sort of rapidly diminishing freedom of press. It also included a different media story on the burgeoning Nollywood film scene and the sort of ways in which those two things both coexist, right? There's a huge thriving media ecosystem in one area, but if you want to be writing news stories, if you want to be kind of bringing truth to power, you're very limited, and you have to take some real risks. Similarly, a piece above, Birding Hurts Your Neck, by Ghanem Malouf, who was the editor of El Malpasante, kind of the New Yorker of Bogota. And a piece by him that, again, I don't know where else he would have had a chance to publish this, right? On the ways in which the sort of nature community, nature tourists both have power and also are used by the many people in that industry and sort of who has agency at different times when it comes to nature tourism in the Amazon. So these are the kinds of pieces. When one more thing I'll say on this is that when we conceived of the general mission for Stranger's Guide, we had three guiding pieces because that we needed to define each story, because otherwise it sort of felt like, well, this could be about anything. It could be anywhere. And those were that it was intimate, idiosyncratic, and illuminating. And it just happened that they all started with I. But one of the reasons for that was because we wanted these to be stories that looked at how broad global themes played out in daily life, the ways in which, the stories we read in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, these big headlines. What does that mean when you're living in a place? What does it mean, whether it's great news or terrible news, right? But how is life continues? And one thing I did an interview recently, and we were sort of chatting about what are sort of lessons we want to kind of talk about with our children. And I think particularly in the West, there's a tendency for the screen to go blank when bad things happen, right? Sort of there's something terrible happens, and then it becomes unimaginable after that. And so for us, part of building empathy, part of building global citizenship and awareness of perspective is what happens after sort of the screen goes blank, right? What happens when bombs are falling? What happens when you have to leave your home in a manner not of your choosing? And what happens, in your daily life? What does lunch look like? What is sort of life like for your children, et cetera? And so that intimacy and idiosyncrasy were both really important to us, and I think set us aside. So how we do this, it begins always by listening, and a lot of what we think about in terms of our work is holding space. So we begin with building an advisory board of writers, of journalists, but also of business owners, of intellectuals and academics, of a wide variety of people who can provide us with perspectives on the stories they want to tell about their community, about the stories they would like to see others tell, and about things they wish other people knew, right? So sort of a wide array of sort of perspectives and points of information that we start with. Those advisors tend to help us connect with writers, connect with potential contributors. And when possible, we travel to each location that we publish about. We also really work hard to partner with local publications and local organizations on the ground to ensure that our work can kind of help amplify work that's already happening and build a bigger platform for that work in the US. Because again, what we're trying to do is reflect a community back to provide space, hold space for a community to kind of fill with the stories they want to share with each other, and also with a sort of secondary awareness for how they can sort of represent that community to others in the US and elsewhere. We work with local publications. We also bring US-based journalism standards, right? So we fact check everything. That's not a typical sort of process in a lot of places. We work, in terms of making sure that the pieces really hold up, I think, so that we feel like readers will stick with them. But we also are extremely flexible. And this is, I think, really important because I think there's a tendency. We talk to a lot of publications who say, oh, we'd love to do this. We'd love to do what you do. We want to see more writers from other countries. We want to include more perspectives. But what they often mean by that is they want to do that when the sort of final products that are produced look just like they would have looked had you sent an American journalist over there, and typically an American man, and typically a white American man, right? Because that tends to be the framework, the lens for how stories get told in the US. And so we work really hard to have a lot of flexibility about the ways that stories are told. And that I'm going to go through that a little bit later, but our issues, I want to look with you all at three particular issues that we did, one on Tehran, one on Colombia, and one on Scandinavia. And what you see when you look, if you've ever had Colombians, Iranians, and Scandinavians together in a room, you can know that there are real cultural differences, and those have implications for how stories get told, the tone, the approach, everything really. And so we really work hard to provide that flexibility within the context of a page. We also work with other partners to try to do things in more multimedia formats as well. And finally, we work really hard to do events. We think events are a key way to build trust, to build community. And so we do that both throughout the editorial process. We have meetings with our advisory boards. We have meetings in location with our contributors so they can meet each other. And then afterwards to build audience. And we do those in the US. We've also partnered with groups as far away as the ZEG Festival in Georgia, bringing writers and photographers from different issues we've published to Tbilisi. But we really want to help those who contribute to our work, contribute to each issue, have a broader microphone from which to speak. So I wanted to start with our Tehran guide. This is the cover. Each cover is designed to kind of feel a little bit intriguing, and also to mimic old travel posters. But here, I think you can see we have pieces that don't just reflect important information that we want we want our readers to know about Tehran at this moment. They also capture a different style of storytelling. So here we have our postcards on city life. Ranged from a piece on virtual Tehran for someone writing from the diaspora who could no longer go and sort of builds his connection to the city through YouTube videos. But it also included artists who were writing about kind of being down and out in sort of the artistic quarter of the city, scoring drugs, trying to kind of lead a fairly bohemian lifestyle in an underground manner. We also wrote about the theater scene in Tehran, not something that I think we hear about much in the US, but a tremendously political place where a lot of discussion, a lot of the kinds of debates that in the US might play out in more direct ways. I believe this, you believe that, let's debate, play out in much more nuanced and artistic ways through theatrical performances, and particularly through avant-garde theater. We also have pieces that do give that broader history, sort of how the kind of generational change amongst revolution. And then most significantly, we have these pieces, Under the Skin of the City and Crossing Tehran, that are very intimate stories that hopefully have broader implications. One about a reporter's kind of relationship with a sex worker and his sort of back and forth during COVID as he kind of contemplates his role. And another by an editor trying to cross Tehran in time to see a football game, a soccer game, on the one day that the stadium was open to women. And sort of what happens to her in this kind of madcap journey. These aren't stories that are really designed to tell you what to think. They're funny, they're sort of weird, but they are designed to give an intimate feeling to what it's like to be in a cab, what it's like to be a woman trying to find a guardian so that you can get in the cab, right? All of the different cultural norms and differences that make a part of daily life there. I also want to highlight, in terms of the ways stories are told and the differences, this is a photo essay we published as part of the guide called Volcano. And this is, I think, typical of the way, the sort of approach that we saw from a lot of our contributors, which was, let's talk about, we'll talk about whatever we want to talk about, but we'll do it in a nuanced way. We prefer to use symbols. We want to sort of think about it where any statement can have, 5 to 10 meanings. And this photo essay is I think a great encapsulation of that approach. Here, Dashti, the photographer, took pictures that look almost like stock photography, right? They're sort of clearly canned. People are just smiling. Look, and then in every issue, in every photo, I don't know if you notice, there's this strange monster's tail. And you don't really know why it's there. And our photographer wasn't really going to tell you why it was there. But all isn't well, right? And I think that's her point. She doesn't need to explicate. She doesn't need to hit you over the head, but she wants you to know that there are, on any scene you see, that's taking place across many, many layers. Contrast that with our Colombia guide. Our Colombia guide, we worked in close partnership with El Maupassante, which I mentioned earlier. And here you see a very different approach to storytelling, much more overtly political, much just sort of generally, a lot of declarative statements. And again, beautiful, right? Here again, we tried to bring together sort of very lyrical essays. Ode to Bogota by Juli Lopera, Delgado Lopera is a beautiful lyrical essay. And it's coupled with a Gabriel Garcia Marquez series that had never been translated into English before. And we were able to do, in part because we built so much trust with the editors at El Maupassante. They said, you might be interested in this. We're going to publish this in Spanish. Would you be interested in doing this with us in English? And here we also looked at stories that I think don't always translate in sort of the simplified political landscape that we've sort of ended up with in the US, partially because of the decline in media. So here's a story on farmers who took government deals with regard to coca, stopped farming it, and then found tremendous broken promises. In some cases, ended up going back to it. In other cases, suffered as a result of not doing so. And so those are stories that are complicated. There's not really an obvious kind of right left. There's not an obvious red blue, the way that I think we tend to have stories here. Instead, they're sort of messy, and I think we try to embrace that and recognize that many countries' issues don't fall neatly on kind of a U.S. political landscape. And then finally, I wanted to highlight our Scandinavia guide because, again, a very different approach. And Scandinavia guide included pieces that I think you would expect: the crayfish culture, sort of a joyful piece on the communities and cultural traditions around summer in Sweden. Jumping in, this kind of lovely piece on the sort of renaissance of ice swimming, with one of my favorite portraits ever that we've published. But alongside this, we see some of the real complexities of Scandinavian culture, and these are stories. Again, we published Rotten in the Welfare State in partnership with a Danish publication, looking at the ways in which Denmark's welfare state has served to really, in some cases, harass and force assimilation on immigrants, and in particular Muslim immigrants, to the country. And what's interesting is that alongside this story, we had a piece on Black jazz musicians who had come to Denmark in the 70s and found it to be a far more welcoming and healthy environment for creative expression than they were finding in the US at the same time. So we brought these two pieces in conversation alongside, I think, climate, first-person narratives from immigrants to Scandinavia. Again, I think our goal here was to both reflect a Scandinavian style of storytelling alongside issues and perspectives that I think we don't typically hear in the US when we talk about Scandinavia. I think it tends to be a fairly idealized place, particularly in more progressive circles. Alongside that, I wanted to share just this photo essay, which I love. Carl Johan Utsi is a Sami reindeer herder who started taking photographs to supplement his income, and has turned as an extraordinary talent. But here we see a sort of window into Sami daily life, modern Sami reindeer life that I think you don't see. Here's, traditional Sami attire, but with an IKEA bag, right? And part of that is the wink, wink, nod, nod that I think you see in sort of Scandinavian humor, which was sort of right throughout the issue. And alongside that, a look at sort of traditional housing with a motorcycle, right? And I think for Carl Johan, that kind of tension was what he really wanted to explore in his photographs. And this is something I want to say that he really wanted to express to fellow Scandinavians, because there's been a long history of sort of exclusion for Sami peoples, as well as to audiences outside of Scandinavia, right? And so again, sort of the tension of what are the stories that we want to share within our community that sort of ask hard questions, and then also how do we want to represent our community to other communities. So lastly, I'll just sort of add a couple of things about Stranger's Guide and the work we do. You know, we work really hard to put these pieces together. Obviously, we want to make sure that they get seen and that they get processed. We do that in a number of different ways. Again, I think we always start with a question of partnership. Who can we work with? Who can we partner with? How can we sort of do things that are mutually beneficial in and kind of work towards a greater goal. And so here we've been very fortunate, thanks to folks including Chip on this call. We've had relationships with a number of different organizations, ranging from Alight, which was formerly the American Refugee Committee, alongside Fotografiska, a museum, an international photography museum, and many other kinds of organizations, both locally and in the US. We also do a lot of events. I mentioned those earlier. Those are both in the countries that we cover. I should add here that we do a quarter of our work is US based. So we've turned our sort of approach and our style not just to countries outside the US, but also to Texas, to California, to New Orleans, Chicago, and elsewhere. And we think that's also really important. But in all cases, we do events in those locations, and we try to work with bookstores, with libraries, and with others in each place to help these stories reach audiences there. We've moved to a Substack approach for our digital work, and I think that's proven to help reach out to communities that aren't place-based, right? This is a way of getting communities based more on issue interest. But one of the things I think is neat for us is that sometimes we're able, because our work straddles so many different kinds of stories, we reach people who maybe aren't so interested in news, right? We tend to have this problem in the US in particular, where the people who are reading news are reading tons of it, and everybody else is finding ways to avoid it because it's pretty depressing. It can feel pretty disheartening, etc. And so because we take a different approach to storytelling, one of the interesting things is that we find ourselves in tourism conversations. We find ourselves in venues looking at music or looking at sports. And those kinds of venues, I think, are shockingly open and interested to hearing more about sort of these dynamics of power, these tough questions that I think we all want to be bringing in, whilst also kind of maintaining a relationship to joy and kind of communal pride and all of these other things that we think are really important. And then finally, we experiment a lot. And hopefully that's something we can get into in the second half as we start to discuss and here kind of have more of a dialogue. So finally, looking forward, I just sort of, here, sort of the questions that are on my mind. How do we mediate between communicating place inward and communicating place outward? How can place-based communities build new shared narratives and stories? And how can communities communicate through place-based stories? So communities aren't always place-based. There are a lot of different ways that we find community. How are place-based stories a useful tool for them? So with that, I'll stop share and hand it back over to the ProSocial folks, because I hope we can have a dialogue and a bit of discussion.
Wow, that was so amazing. So sorry to be a couple minutes late. I had internet problems, but I'm so happy that I came. And wow, please raise your virtual hands to speak. And that was so rich, Abby. I'm just lost in admiration and so grateful to Chip for introducing us. So anyhow, looking forward to the conversation that's about to ensue.
Thank you so much. And thanks for those on chat. I can use chat as well. can I say more about what I mean with the first question, inward, outward? Absolutely. So I think that there are two ways, I'll say that this is something I thought a lot more about because of ProSocial and the work that ProSocial has done, right? Is that I think that when we talk about community stories, there are two ways we need to be thinking about them. One is how can we build greater cohesion? How can like a place be a meaningful form of sort of community? Because right now, I think particularly in the US, it's not sufficient, right? We see a lot of people are in a place that happens to be where they live, but there's not a lot of relationship or connection to that place in terms of whether you're talking about it from a civic perspective, right? Like, are they aware of what's happening with municipal bonds or something like that? Are they aware what's happening in their high school? But also from a joy and pride and sort of anti-loneliness perspective, do they know what cool community garden group is happening or the exciting free concerts in the park, right? All of that, how do we communicate as a community? How do we build a sense of who we are as a community? And how can we do that in new ways that are more inclusive, that sort of help break down maybe power structures that previously existed and didn't serve the greater good? So that's how do we use place-based stories in our, to look inward. But similarly, I think a really important thing that's happened with, sort of rising sort of hyperpolarization and kind of hyperpartisanship, et cetera, is there's a sense of communities as good and bad, as like us or not like us. And so we want to communicate inward. What does it mean to be from Austin, Texas, where I'm from? Or where does it mean to be from Waco, Texas, where my family is from, right? Like a small place. But then also, what does it mean when I tell you that I'm from those places? How do we build greater communication around what it means to be from other locations with other, with real differences, real cultural differences, real differences in values, but in a way such that we can have conversation and sort of mediate those differences in some ways, right? So I think that's where that question is for me. And Anna, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, and so sorry that I'm in my car right now, but I wanted to make sure that I saw this.
Thank you for joining
Yeah.
us. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Oh, and I know that you and I have talked about um how we can include some of the like the more pro-social gatherings and like place-based discussions where we are encouraging community members to come out and have their like be able to share their voice. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you could speak a little bit more about like because you said that gatherings were such an important part of the advisory council and publications. I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit more to what you have done in terms of gatherings to share stories and what you hope to do.
Absolutely. And I just want to sort of underscore Anna and Awakening Land's kind of amazing work and really just a really inspiring group. So if you aren't already familiar, definitely take a look. Yeah, so we've done a lot. I will say we haven't done our track record is slightly broken by the fact that we launched at the end of 2018, sort of had just gotten going and then spent sort of the better part of 2 years in COVID, right? So of the sort of 5.5 years we've been around, a third of that was in sort of COVID time. I mean, not that COVID times have ended, but sort of in sort of the lockdown era. So we've done that in a lot of different ways, though, is the answer. In a few different ones I'd talk about. So we gather together when possible. Our editor-in-chief or myself, usually both, or not usually, occasionally both, go to a location, and we, by that point, have usually already convened our advisory board for that issue, for that guide. And we're not going in blind at all. We've done a lot of legwork, a lot of research, listening, learning, and getting a sense of, the creative community that we want to engage and invite. And so that's kind of part one. We usually then hold like a fun gathering. Sometimes that's hosted, often by people on the advisory council. And in that event, there's often a lot of listening, right? So that event often will end up with people starting to talk, depending on the size. People will sort of make toasts, or they'll start chatting and taking turns. A lot is kind of culturally dependent, right, on sort of the norms around sort of social gatherings. But that's a place where we just do a lot of listening and sort of invite people from primarily creative industries, right, to come in. So that tends to be a crowd that's more voluble, I would say, in almost every community. So that's a place that we start. From there, though, we've partnered with a lot of groups to try to bring those stories in different ways. So what I mean by that, we did an issue on New Orleans, and we partnered with a hotel, and that hotel had kind of moved into a vacant building, but also was sort of a newcomer, and I think had a lot of work to do to build trust, frankly, in the neighborhood in which it had come. But meanwhile, we were partnering with a lot of the contributors from the issue who were really interested and eager to have an opportunity to perform and talk about their work. So we decided to put on an event at this hotel, and it included, I think, a set of different pieces that you wouldn't see typically together. And this was an issue, an effort to engage the broader neighborhood, the broader community in New Orleans. And so that event began with music, with a sort of musical performance. It then moved into a reading by one of our contributors on a piece called Acid Church. That's a pretty powerful piece by a woman whose family were early Black landowners in Louisiana who found the land on which they lived. It became known as Cancer Alley because it became a dumping ground for chemical companies, right? And sort of her experience as a Black woman and why New Orleans was a special, so it sort of takes you back and forth between her caring for her grandmother who's dying in the home that she grew up in this sort of land a little bit outside of New Orleans, and then her being in New Orleans and sort of partying and using drugs and sort of like having this experience of freedom, really, and sort of what that kind of, when that feels hollow and when that doesn't, to her as a Black woman in New Orleans and with a sort of roots in Louisiana. So that was a pretty heavy reading, right? That wasn't, you have a jazz singer and then you go into some pretty heavy issues. Then, however, we partnered her with a photographer who had done a series called Turning a Look on sort of party culture in New Orleans. And Turning a Look was a photo essay that included a ton of portraits of New Orleanians in various costumes. And so they had a conversation about their experiences and sort of how sort of party culture was and wasn't a part of New Orleanian culture, right? Like how it kind of drew in tourists and sort of could be extremely extractive, but also how it was very meaningful. And then it ended with a queer burlesque show, again, pretty specific to New Orleans, I would say. And that event brought in a cross section of people who didn't know each other. It was an unusual gathering of sort of some educators and some, sort of older folks who, sort of been in New Orleans for many generations, people who had kind of been drawn to New Orleans, had lived there now, but sort of didn't have roots there. So that's a different example, right? And so with the different events, I mean, I'm sort of going event by event in my head because I think it's a great question. I think there are two kinds of events we do. One are events trying to bring in new perspectives and sort of create and sort of get idea generation going. The second set of events that we do, usually after publication, are events really designed to engage and to educate and to amplify the work that we've published by these different writers. And so I think sometimes, however, those works in our lab, a different example that I think is kind of to your point, we brought in, we have a series, a lot of the work that we publish is not a lot, but of the first persons that we do, they've often have to be done anonymously. So for instance, we did a series in Tehran of LGBTQ residents in Tehran. And for a number of reasons, that's obviously extremely dangerous to even talk about. And all of the people who contributed those stories were extremely brave to do so at all. And none of it could be traced back to them. But we did work with different groups in the US to do some presentations and some readings of those works. And I think those readings ended up being, their own creative outcomes and outputs, right? Like in the process of telling those stories by primarily immigrant performers in the US, there was an ability to kind of talk about what can be said here and what can be said in what can't be said in other places. So anyways, I feel like I have a lot more to say on this, Anna, and I feel like I may need to come back to it a little bit, but I think the last thing I would say is I think we used to think at the beginning, when we first started Stranger's Guide, I think we had this idea that it would be, we're coming from more traditional places, right? And so we had this idea that we would have an editorial process and it would yield an editorial product, and then we would like send that around, right? And what we've come to see is, I think, much more that the publication as like a sort of chapter in a much longer kind of process that is one of community engagement. And that starts when we convene our editorial advisory boards, when we start asking and just listening and holding space, but that continues afterwards. And that's also where the internet becomes really helpful. We can continue to bring people's perspectives in, to let people add on to stories they've written, and so on and so forth. So thanks. I think I got there in the end, but thank you for letting me talk that through. And I saw Carla wanted to make a comment.
Oh, thank you very much. So this was very interesting. My comment has to do with Theater of the Oppressed. Theater of the Oppressed is a mechanism by which a new narrative is created. Theater of the Oppressed, I'm sure you know perfectly, but just in case some of the audience don't, is a style of community interaction invented in Brazil about 6 decades ago, where a performance, a very simple short performance is shown, which demonstrates some very standard and damaging way in which people in the village interact. And then it invites any member of the audience to take the role of a victim in that short play and try to stop the cruelty or the victimization. And then everybody can respond and say, "Oh, that's crazy," or "that makes sense." But it is a way in which marginalized people can create a new representation of what's right, instead of just leaving it to the people who control the news, who control the speaker positions to create that representation. And you just mentioned Cancer Alley. This would be an interesting place in which to see if that has occurred or if that could be done. A brilliant sociologist named Arlie Hochschild wrote a book on Cancer Alley called Strangers in Their Own Land, about how people are accepting a story which is completely counter to the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could get them to confront that in Theater of the Oppressed, get brilliant authors to help you, it could be something very important and really change the story and change your life.
Thank you for that. I am familiar with Theater of the Oppressed. It's extraordinary work. Yeah, I love it. In the comments I did put the essay by that I was referencing by Courtney Desiree Morris, which I think it's a really extraordinary piece of writing. It actually was recognized in America's Best Magazine Writing. It was up for a National Magazine Award for Best Essay, and I think it's a really special piece. And I think to your point, it's the kind of piece, it's messy, right? And I think that messier pieces have very few outlets right now in the US. There are very few places for essays, for articles, or for other kinds of artistic creation that sort of that don't fit into sort of preconceived narratives. So I think that need is really important.
Who was
Um,
Courtney Morris?
Courtney Desiree Morris. She's the author of the piece.
And is it about Theater of the Oppressed?
No, I think you mentioned Theater of the Oppressed in relation to Cancer Alley. And so I was mentioning that because we ran a piece about
Cancer Alley.
well,
So she,
it's really about New Orleans, but yes, that was where the it came up. So I just thought it might be relevant, but
I see. Okay, I'll
yeah.
look.
Chip, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, but you go first.
Okay, well, I have actually 3 questions, which I can ask in rapid order, and they're all related to collaborations that I hope to form with you. And one is to basically to engage you in some of our place-based efforts, such as in Buffalo with Anna. And so the question there would be, how would the wonderful work that you do when you cover a place be combined with an actual initiative to work in that place? How can those be combined? I'll just answer my questions, all 3 at once. Then how could it be sustained as something that basically that really leads to something that is ongoing, not something that begins and ends? And then third, can this be applied to smaller projects? Because somebody on this call is Jean Willoughby, working with the Agrarian Trust, and um, they're working with very small communities of that are using land held in common. And so these are wonderful stories, but they're miniature stories. That's my point. Rather than a relatively large region, such as a city or a bioregion or something like that. This is a more focused project. And how would you organize storytelling around that? So if you can keep those 3 questions in mind, then
All right, I took notes, but I may need if I start to veer off, like roll me back.
And my question will do the same, but with a tougher challenge. So take David's first.
Oh man. All right. Oh, wish me luck, everybody. Okay. So on the combination, I mean, this is where I think my interest as kind of wearing 2 different hats comes in, right? Because I think that in a lot of communities, the need for sort of civic information, generally speaking, is pretty important. And so when I think about these guides, I think print is actually a tremendously useful tool in communities, because it can be something that sticks around, that can be shared, that can be passed on from groups to groups. You don't need to proactively find it, right, in communities. You can sort of have it in libraries, you can have it in meeting spaces. So I think that when we talk about like then what should be in that, right? Like so is a print of a helpful tool in a sort of project like the ones you're trying to start in Buffalo and elsewhere to kind of bring a pro-social movement, or sort of amplify what the pro-social movement that sort of already exists in these different places, right? For me, I think it's twofold. One is that every community has storytellers, has expert storytellers. And it's all about finding them and figuring out how to meet them where they are, right? So that's really fundamental to our approach. We aren't there are other groups. I will say there's other groups that do more what I would sort of call like grassroots storytelling, where it's sort of like everybody submits something and we sort of publish it all together. And that's great. I'm all for everything that sort of gets more stories out there. But I do think there's a reason that like storytelling has always been an expertise forever, forever and ever and ever. And I think that's a really important thing. And that's sort of where we lean in. So I think you start by sort of finding people, within a community who are doing the work, and people within a community who are storytellers. And you bring them together, you convene them. And that's what like our editorial advisory boards basically are. But I think if it's being done in concert with other initiatives, so much the better, because those editorial these meetings, I'm calling them editorial advisory meetings, they can be project meetings with a sort of storytelling component, with an editorial component to them, right? Like if you're talking about what needs to be addressed in Buffalo, That's very similar to an ideas generation meeting that we'd be having if we were doing a Buffalo issue and didn't know you, and didn't yet know you. But then, of course, as we did the meeting, we would learn all about Anna, and we would learn, right? Like that's the whole goal. So I think that sort of the processes kind of naturally link, but the importance of identifying the storytellers and artists is maybe an emphasis that wouldn't otherwise be there. And that's where we, I think, bring in our networks, our sort of expertise.
So
So
could you say a little bit more about how you identify storytellers and artists so that you do it? I'd just like to know a little bit about, give me a bit more of an organic feel as to how do you find those storytellers and
I mean,
artists?
to be really honest with you, it's all about building trust through networks. That's like that, because I think that especially like, look, I'm, publications and, when you're working as a US based publication abroad, when you're working as a sort of somewhat mainstream publication in the US, those are not, those don't have great track records, right? When you're a marginalized storyteller in a particular community, why trust these stories are so valuable. They're so meaningful to people. Like, why trust, where you put them, what spaces you choose to give them to is a really important thing. And I think I actually think that's something we never take lightly, right? Whenever anyone works with us, we take really seriously that is about trust first and foremost. Things don't always work out the way you want, but like trust is the most important kind of piece. And that approach has really been critical. So for us, what that's meant is that now almost anywhere in the world, we can say, you know what, we don't know anyone in Sierra Leone, but we know a lot of writers and photographers and community leaders in Aceh, in Lagos, and in Johannesburg, and in Cape Town. And between those 4 cities, we can find some really amazing people to start a conversation with in Sierra Leone, right? Similarly, like, I may not know who the writers are to start with in Buffalo, but I know groups, I know sort of networks and leaders in other cities in the US and other communities in the US who can make introductions and say, like, these are people you can trust. These are people who will be honest with you, will communicate clearly with you, and will treat your story with respect.
Okay.
And so that's, I think, really where I mean, that sounds really pat. That actually is a ton of work. Right? Because stories come in and you're like, oh, this wasn't what we were one thing that happens a lot for us is we'll say, okay, well, we need to make sure we have a story that addresses X, right? Okay, we have these writers, we have these photographers, we have these topics that really need to be addressed, right? But life is life, right? And creative people are creative people. And, the story that you thought was going to be about
Turns out
the
why.
music scene in Buffalo turns out to be something extraordinary about, a child and their grandma, and music doesn't end up coming up in it that much. And so you have to kind of roll with that. And we have a lot of tricks I say tricks, a lot of strategies we use to then say, okay, that story's not going to be a music story. That wasn't the story that writer needed to share. That ended up being something different. So we're going to educate on music in the community in a different way. We're going to do it through a fact box. We're going to do it through a creative cartoon, or, we're going to do something else to give voice to that. And we're going to let the story be the story. And I'm sorry, there's like the chat notes as well, so I'm trying to keep them up. And so then, yeah, exactly. And so working to Anna's point, right? Like, working with local publications is really important in this respect too, because it can help not just bring them in, help make sure our work is better, but also hopefully contribute to their sustainability and ours, right? That it sort of hopefully brings them more awareness. Sometimes we'll find, like when we were doing the Chicago issue, we partnered with The Trace, which is a outlet that focuses on gun violence, and is heavily based largely based in Chicago. And it was so interesting because one of the reporters from The Trace and one of the other contributors to the issue had never met each other. They live in Chicago. They sort of knew, and they'd always wanted to know each other. They connected that way. But thanks to The Trace, we were able to get into additional Chicago bookstores and libraries that we wouldn't have gotten into. Another area just on this front that hasn't come up yet, but I would sort of mention again on this question of sort of sort of different partnerships. We actually have partnered a lot. We put emphasis on stories of incarceration. We sort of say, this is, prisons are a part of almost every community, and they're sort of purposefully unseen in a lot of places. And so we try to make, to make an effort to include stories from, either currently, more often formerly incarcerated individuals about their experience as part of a community that didn't necessarily see them as such, right? And so as we do that work, what ends up, to do that, to get inside a prison, you have to develop relationships. There's usually a prison writing program. There's a leader in the community who we have to work with, whose trust we have to earn, and so on and so forth. And then that's worked out in almost every case we've sought to do so. So yeah, so I mean, I think that, so in terms of like the sustained ongoing, one of the key things we believe in is email newsletters is a really big way that we communicate. And one of the things I'd love to see, we haven't actually been in a position to do this because we've never gotten to work with, I think, an ongoing effort in the way that, David, that you're kind of talking about. And I think it's extremely exciting for us because it feels so sort of like fellow travelers, kind of meeting. But we've talked a lot about how can we build like specialized newsletters that kind of continue to tell stories, maybe put a piece, we take a lot of pains to make our pieces evergreen so that they feel relevant and important to be read, whether you're reading them the day after they were published or 5 years after they were published. But one of the things we can do is contextualize those pieces, bring them back. Like these are often, serious works, and have the writer revisit their piece 6 months later or a year later, right? Sort of building a community online in a digital space that's, maybe rooted through some of these long form narratives. And that in that respect, I've actually been working in a different project with the folks at New Public, who have taken a lead on like, how can we build healthier digital spaces for civic engagement and participation? And I think there's a lot that we could, borrow from their work as we look at communities like Buffalo and elsewhere to kind of build healthier digital storytelling spaces.
Yeah.
And then lastly, on the smaller projects, absolutely, you can do this. I think one question is always like, is the best approach one of long form narrative, which tends to be where we do the bulk of our work. There are a lot of ways though to do this, and that's sort of why I wanted to go through these different issues that we did, because those looked really different, right? We had to, one example, Tehran, photography is much, oddly enough, much more prone to result in arrest than the writing. So we couldn't like the effort to get a few photographs of just like downtown Tehran was really difficult. And our photo essays, as I showed you with that volcano photo essay, they were highly symbolic and sort of highly staged. We didn't expect that. We hadn't really worked that much with artistic photographers in the past. We'd worked more with, sort of documentary style photographers, but that was not what we were going to do in Tehran. So similarly, I think, one question for Jean and Luis is if you're looking in a community where maybe you don't have a ton of long form writers or, serious photography experts, no problem. Maybe think about doing more of what we talked about with that, like first person narratives, where you interview people and you edit their stories into sort of short essays, and you couple that with portraits and sort of photos of them. And that can be extremely powerful. You can do, I mean, we've gotten pretty creative, I would say, over 6 years in terms of ways to help encapsulate different stories when they don't lend themselves to kind of the formats that, American magazine publishing has decided are the most take So
Awesome.
I would love to talk about it. I mean, this is what I love to do, is figure out how to make it work, how to take the stories in a community and make them accessible and available to more people within the community and outside.
Wow, that's so good. Chip.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit reluctant to do this, so I'm going to start with a plug. And that is, if you need to buy holiday presents for people who have everything, Stranger's Guide is the perfect gift. And the Substack version is quite cheap. So
Thanks,
now I'm
Chip.
going to get tough. And I like putting Rapoports in positions where they have to be creative and curious, which goes back to her grandfather. I've been at the Mercatus Center for the last 3 days, and a use case scenario potentially for the ProSocial Action Lab and for Abby's kind of work came up. And here's the situation. Everyone there thinks Eleanor Ostrom walks on water from a more conservative starting point, more libertarian starting point than certainly I do coming to it. So core design principles, evolution, things in, dealing with common resources, everyone gets that. Then I met a group that has two characteristics that are relevant here. First, they call themselves prohuman.org, and they focus heavily around first the kind of psychological flexibility stuff that ProSocial does. And second, their main entry point to getting people to think this way is someone we met 10 years ago at Gretchen's first husband's 70th birthday party, which was a swing dance. And there was this Black rockabilly pianist there who we met a couple years later. We learned that he has built his career meeting Klan members through his music and talking them out of the Klan, to the point that he has given away daughters of Klan members at their weddings. He goes to Klan members' funerals after they've been killed by other Klan members. And I mean, Abby, you will appreciate this, having good Southern roots. This all started one night when he was playing in a band in rural Maryland. Only Black guy, of course, in the room. And this guy comes up to him and says, "You sound just like Jerry Lee Lewis." And this is before all the stuff about Jerry Lee Lewis's problems with younger girls became a problem. This is in the 90s, early 80s, 90s. And he said, Jerry Lee Lewis learned this music from Black people. And after a while, the guy says, "Well, I've never met a Black person before. I'm in the Klan." And they start talking. And he starts bringing this guy into contact with other Klan members. And what this pro-human group is going to try to do is to train people in the kind of techniques that Daryl developed, not going and playing music with Klan members, but the kind of, in pro-social terms, the psychological flexibility stuff. And so I said to the guy who put the money up to make this happen, who you met it as we were leaving, what about, they're trying to create ambassadors to take this stuff into communities. I said, what about Buffalo? Or what about Waco? And how could we work with a group like this that probably overlaps with ProSocial half, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, overlaps with what we do at AFP about the same, overlaps a little bit, Abby, with the kinds of work that you want to do. How would you do that going to the New Public stuff online? So, this really is an unfair question to ask because I couldn't begin to answer it, and I've been thinking about it for a few hours. Abby, how would you deal with that? And
Like,
clearly,
how would you work with a
your
group?
grandfather would have loved to have been in the room, right?
Sure. Any room, my grandfather would live in. So the question is sort of how to work with groups like this that are sort of trying. I mean, I think it's funny, right? Like our role, this is where you can kind of cop out as a journalist, right? Like, the question is who's doing the work, and we can be there to collect those stories. We can be there to kind of figure out what stories are most resonant to come out. I do think, the question of like what's most urgent, what needs to be told, like what kind of comes together. I mean, I think for us, one of the things that we think about a lot is sort of the balance, right? How do you tell stories that both capture, joy and pride in place? It's really important. I think it's a critical piece of every community. And it's equally important to like ask really hard questions and like ask uncomfortable questions. And like those two things have to be in tension. And I think that's really what we work hard to try to do in Stranger's Guide. Like we want it to be funny, we want it to be like lush and kind of wonderful. And we want there to be like pieces that like, I mean, and I'll say like we've published plenty of stuff that's left me uncomfortable. Like there have been articles where I sort of have thought like, oh, ooh, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that, right? But like that's fine. That's the point, right? Like is to kind of be okay with a level of discomfort. And I think to some degree what media offers is literally a mediated experience, right? You don't have to jump all in. You can sort of start to process something, start to experience something and sort of get ready. It's why like we give pre-reading, right? Because it gives you a chance to kind of mull. And so I think when you're talking about situations where people are coming from really different places, I actually sort of wonder if our role wouldn't be better suited to almost like being a resource that they can share, right? Like what would it look like to collect oral narratives, to collect histories, to like sort of offer, here's a story of Buffalo written by, Black Buffalo, right? Historically, or, and then like present that, right? Like this is a city that existed the whole time. You had your narrative of your city. This city was also existing. So how does that feel? How do you sit with that? How does that work for you, right? Sort of how can, so I think that our role doesn't always have to be at the end. Sometimes it's at the beginning. Maybe it's like, what are the stories? What is the shared, what are the shared pieces of information that we can start with and then root our conversation in? To me, that's something that comes to mind when I hear about this work, because so often our narratives, like the story, this is in some ways, I mentioned that I started my career as a political reporter. I graduated from college 2009, 2008. It was a, sort of financial crisis. So I didn't realize that journalism was a particularly, every industry seemed bad in 2008. So I didn't realize quite what I was signing up for. But so 2009, 2010 was really the rise of the birther movement, the Tea Party movement, all of these kinds of things. And I was spending tons of my time in East and West Texas, where these movements were really on the rise. And I felt like it was really important to talk to people, but I also felt like you could, the stories that you could hear by two people. I remember like in Hale Center, Texas, West, it's sort of in the Panhandle area. It's just, and it's a tiny town in Hale County. It's in the center. Never would have guessed. I remember spending a great deal of time with a group of elder, white business leaders who almost all were, getting involved in the Tea Party, all felt that the biggest problems facing their community had to do with immigration, had to do with changing norms, that, things had been better and now they were worse. And literally, I just drove to a different part of the city and sat down with a different community, Black community in Hale Center, whose roots were just as long in the community. Their ancestors had also been in that community for a long time. In some cases as slaves, in some cases as freed Blacks. I mean, it ranged, but a very different story, right? Like, let me tell you what it means that I, live in a country that has a Black president now. That feels like a cause for hope. You know, this city though, I feel like we just got to get out of it. We just got to get our kids out of it. Like all of them were trying to find ways to get their sons out of it, right? Versus, you know, the men I'd sat with that morning who felt like if only people could come back here, the problems are in the cities, right? So how do you start a conversation when you have two groups who are literally 2 miles, 3 miles apart, but like there were no parts of their story that connected, right? It was like they were happening on parallel tracks. And I think for me, a lot of what I think about with the work we try to do and with where storytelling can have civic and cultural meaning is that it can provide sort of jumping off points. The real work, you know, I mean, people like Anna are doing the real work of moving the ball. And I think narrative work is necessary but never sufficient, because the, you know, what it can provide is sort of a framework, a set of stories that then can, I think, hopefully allow for the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of a process. That was a very long-winded answer, but it was a really hard question, so that's what I got.
And
Um,
intended to be.
There you go. Well, I want to make sure Susan Soleil has some nice, easy questions that I feel like I should also answer because I missed them earlier. So one was, what location was the most challenging and why? You know, we've done a variety and we did a Ukraine issue a few months after the war started. And that was challenging for a number of reasons, but like, you know, there were the logistical challenges, right? The fact that, you know, there wasn't Wi-Fi, or the power was out, or people, you know, in some cases we didn't hear from someone. We didn't know, were they dealing with a situation, or were they, you know, were they no longer, you know, alive, right? So I mean, we were dealing with that level of things, but also I think the challenge of just like, you know, we're asking people to engage in creative acts, right? And like when you're sort of you're talking to people in the middle of like deeply traumatic experiences, like how those stories unfold are so like nuanced and complex. And so for us as sort of the receptor, right? Like we're taking these stories in, we're trying to help improve them, but we're not, you know, we're really trying to let our authors guide the process. It's really challenging in a situation where almost everyone, not almost everyone, everyone who was contributing to that issue was in some state of like extreme trauma, right? Like and there was no perspective on that. It wasn't like, you know, and so we've in many other cases, we've done issues where we're working with individuals who are dealing with sort of similar circumstances in some way, shape, or form. But that's probably one of the only examples where the entire issue were people in various states like that. And so that had particular challenges. The Tehran issue was tremendously challenging because we really, you know, we were really honest with I think the key, it was, I spoke to Robert Gahorsam, who comes to New Paradigm Coalition, is teaching a class at my alma mater of Grinnell College. And I spoke to his students and they asked me, how do you guarantee the safety of the contributors? And I said, we can't. And it actually would be like unethical to say we could. What we have to do is be really honest and candid with what we can and can't guarantee, and also make sure that every writer knows exactly what's going in and feels okay and comfortable. And if they change their mind, no hard feelings, right? Like, I mean, that's the situation. And with Tehran, we encountered people who were dying to tell their stories, desperate to tell these stories, like so excited and honored. I mean, it's just shocking to me, like the letters we got back. But two of the people were detained. Thank goodness nobody was arrested or charged. But that was a level, you know, it sort of brought into relief, you know, the stakes of what we're doing. So yeah, so that's the answer to that question. And is this process scalable? I think it really is. I actually do think it's a highly scalable process because you can work with local sort of point people and then sort of have a process that builds up from there. We haven't been in a position to scale, but I'd be lying if I hadn't, you know, it's not what I think about at night, because it definitely is.
I hesitate to ask, which is likely to be the last question. What's your revenue model? And it's like,
That's the hardest question.
How do you make all this work? I mean, because it's so awesome, it's so great, and I'd love for it to be richly self-sustaining. But on the other hand, maybe you have to rely on philanthropy the way a lot of our work does. And so I just wondered, how does this wonderful, wonderful stuff happen? And how is it, can it be really robust in terms of as well it should be?
Well, I'll start by saying, the partnership model is a nice way of saying, kind of rely on the kindness of strangers, right? Like we rely a lot on our partners, not strangers, but others, right? So we launched originally, we have had different models at different times, quite honestly, because the last, 5 years in journalism has been this crazy roller coaster. We launched as a nonprofit. We've always had an eye towards sustainability, and I think our goal has always been to be very nimble. And so that's why we've never really approached scale, right? And I think that's a question that, is worth asking. But we've stayed very, very small and nimble, with the ability to kind of go in, sort of scale up for an individual issue and then scale down depending on the market, depending on the funding for that. And we've actually really moved further in that direction. So we now are an LLC with a fiscal sponsor, so we're able to take philanthropy, and philanthropy is a pretty key piece of our model. But we do work with corporate entities as well. They tend to be like B Corps. So for instance, we did with our Columbia guy, we did a pretty big partnership with Pete's Coffee. And we've done some other sort of similar partnerships at different times. But two other things that I think are of note, we've really moved to being per project. So we used to say, like, we're a quarterly publication, every 3 months an issue will come out. We no longer say that. That's been sort of the gift of moving to Substack. We do a lot on our Substack. We do stories there at length. And then with each issue, we may have years where we're able to publish 5, who knows? And then there may be years where we publish 2. And we almost have moved more to a book publishing model with the guides, right? So we sort of go back and forth. Each one is, they actually have long been ISBNs. So from Library of Congress's perspective, they've been books for many years. And I think increasingly from our perspective, they sort of straddle the book magazine kind of background. But our model is ever evolving. But in large part, it's donors, it's subscribers, and it's sort of grants for specific projects. Those are sort of them, and it's corporate underwriters for particular projects. So those are
Okay.
kind of our main revenue lines.
Okay, great. Well, this has been so awesome, Abby, and
Thank you
it's
so
been
much for having me, and thank you for all these great questions.
well, such a delight to have you and to record this. And so I do hope that in very short time we're working together. And I was late entering this meeting, so I want to leave it just by emphasizing, Juliet probably already did, that this is a weekly seminar series. Just like a university, we have a fall and a spring series. This is the first seminar of the fall series, which alternates between 6 and noon. And you can see the roster of seminars and other events on the calendar section of the ProSocial World website. And so please plan to be a regular. Every one is on a different facet of ProSocial World. And this has been a wonderful one to start with.
Thank you so much.